Old minds hum with memory. Noah tethered his recorder to the shaft to see which kind of remembering it preferred. He had driven out before dawn, the town still wearing its ash-gray quiet. The slag heaps cut the horizon like broken teeth, and the "Do Not Enter" placard at the shaft hung crooked, half-scorched from a fire long ago. Noah set his van's battery on a crate, unpacked a portable preamp, and threaded a length of coax through the chain-link fence until it brushed cold iron. His channel was small, a few thousand subscribers who liked places people forgot, but he had a soft spot for sites his grandfather used to name like prayer. Belting number 3 read Tomas' shift, the Tuesday he'd come home smelling like sulfur. Evelyn Morales arrived with a manila folder and a thermos of coffee so hot it steamed in morning air. Evie ran the county historical room downtown and treated old newspapers like evidence, which made her the sort of person Noah trusted when the town's past felt slippery. She sampled the pipe clip Noah had soldered and ran a hand over the box of earthing clamps like someone blessing tools. "You ready to press send?" she asked, voice soft but steady. He smiled, half nervous. "Ready to listen?" They powered the unit. The old wiring complained, a thin carrier wave that wavered like breath. Static, then a cough of clarity. A grunt. A call sign. The voice that came through was not new. It carried the dry cadence of men who spent their lives betting on coal dust. "Tomas to shift, belting 3. Check your bolts," it said. A name like a rock. Noah laughed out loud because, for a breath, they had a recording. He clicked record, and the green light winked. The commenters would love that. Lost voices, rediscovered. But as the minutes unspooled, the voice did something none of them expected. It began to answer the present. "Good to see you back, Noah," it said, clear as a kitchen knife. "Evie, you left the Alexander manifests in box 3. Evelyn's smile died slowly. She glanced at the folder in her hands as if the letters might peel off the page and rearrange. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Red Tomas died 40 years ago." The voice's tone had the tired intimacy of someone calling across a lunch bell. It did not sound like playback. It sounded like someone reading the world aloud. Noah felt the hair rise on his forearms. "We must be picking up some old loop," he said too quickly. He scrolled through the waveform. No duplication. This was live enough to have an audience. They shared the clip to Noah's channel with a cautious caption. "Found old cum line, brief audio, expect some hiss." People poured comments in within the hour. Skeptics, conspiracy-leaning fans, retired miners tagging names. A local retired shiftmate, Frank Keene, messaged him directly. "If you're really there, come see me. I remember things." Frank was a heavy man with a thin scarf and an appetite for cigarettes. He arrived as the sun clawed out of the slag, his fingers shaking not from the cold. He listened with the slow patience of someone listening for his name. After a long silence, he said the thing the town had never said out loud. "We had deliveries. Night shipments that weren't for the mine. I helped move one crate. It was stamped Corvus. I thought nothing of it then." Noah asked the simple question that lit the fuse. "Who brought it? Who took it off?" Frank looked away as if the name might burn him. "Tomlinson's boys. You know Tomlinson." He swallowed, handed them cash. "Told us to close an eye." The "comes" line, which had been a thin carrier hum, thickened. The voice read Tomas' voice, filled in a gap Frank had left open like a wound. "Tomlinson signed at 11:47, it said. "Ledger entry HB for 2. Payment. 600 francs." Cheek trembled. He started to speak, and then the line moved faster than him, interpolating details he had not said aloud. Names, amounts, a warehouse number at the edge of town that had been converted into a furniture depot. The old man's face went pallid, the cigarette dropping from fingers that no longer held it steady. "It's reading us," Noah breathed. Evie, breathing through her own disbelief, reached for her folder and flipped to a photocopied ledger she pulled from a municipal archive months earlier, a fragment she'd been unable to contextualize. Her finger landed on HB 42. "This," she said, "this is a notation I couldn't place. If that line matches what you heard, if Tomlinson's in that ledger." The name hit the three of them like ice. Tomlinson, the man who had morphed from a warehouse foreman into one of Centralia's polite middle-aged benefactors, had been spoken of at church, raffles, and Rotary meetings. To anyone who refused to dredge, he was the sort of respectable person whose ledger would be laughably administrative. Noah posted another clip. The views skyrocketed. Local news asked for interviews. A mid-morning crowd gathered at the shaft, some skeptical, some hungry for confirmation, some simply there because rumors had a way of making the dead into public property. Sheriff Cal Harlan walked up the beaten path with the slow authority of someone who had spent his life pointing things away from the light. He listened to the playback in the open, hands in his coat, jaw clenched until you could see the tendons stand out. "You don't broadcast this without consequences," he said, when the clip ended. His voice had the weary finality of a man who'd chosen comfort over confrontation too many times to count. "We stop this now, or you'll ruin people who weren't the ones to bury anything." Noah bristled. "We're not ruining anyone, Sheriff. We're listening." "Listening isn't neutral," Harlan said. "The past is a mouth. Let it speak, and it won't pick and choose who it chews." Evelyn's hands were steady, but her eyes were sharp. "Sheriff, if what we heard is true, people disappear because folks didn't ask what was inside the crates. We have fragments of ledger lines. We can corroborate. This isn't just spectacle." The sheriff let out a breath that sounded like surrender and threat sewn together. "You think you can handle the fallout? There are families here, Evie. There are livelihoods. You dig one place, and the rest of the earth will move." And the shaft, as if on cue, laughed, a thin carrier warble that coalesced into that voice. "Names wash up."
They want to be found.
There was a gust of wind, dust skittering across the crowd. The shaft's wire hummed low, like a string pulled taut. On the edge of the gathered people, faces turned as if someone had said their names aloud. A woman gripped her coat tighter. An older man's jaw clenched. The Cums said nothing else for a long beat then. In a voice that had the bitter sweetness of a man who'd seen everything and could not keep his mouth shut, it spoke one single, unambiguous name. The name landed like a stone. Silence dropped over the shaft. Someone somewhere swallowed. Noah could hear his own pulse in his ears, loud as a bell. When the crowd began to ripple with whispers, and the sheriff lowered himself into a crouch that was equal parts anger and fear, Noah hit stop on the recorder with hands that trembled. He had come for ghosts, for a story that would make a few late nights brighter. Instead, the mind had begun to remember in a voice that did not need consent, and it had just named the first of the town. Respectable people to hold history like an unpaid debt. They could not unhear it. The name had broken the morning open like a thrown glass. By noon, the clip of Red Tomas speaking it was threaded through local feeds, played 100 ways, shocked, outraged, mocking. Tomlinson's name was in everyone's mouth, and the man himself answered the whisper with a practiced swagger and a lawyer's retinue. He denied everything in a calm that looked rehearsed on television. Words are thin armor against a ledger, and a voice that refuses to be bought. Evie and Noah spent the afternoon combing municipal records in the town library's brittle boxes. The Cums had given them the line HB 42, a brittle county ledger. Evie found it Tomlinson's initials, beside a cross-reference to Corvus Logistics and a series of nocturnal entries. Those lines were small, legal-seeming things: pickup, client amount. The ledger did not say what the crates contained. It only mapped movement, and movement was proof enough. Noah posted the ledger clip, and the town's assumption turned toward action. Sheriff Harlan, who had threatened silence that morning, now had subpoenas on his desk and lawyers knocking at his office door. He called a meeting in the VFW, asking anyone with memory to come forward. The hall filled with faces weathered by time. Men who had worked shifts, women who'd kept the books, neighbors who remembered the trucks. When Frank took the microphone, he could not keep his hands from trembling. He tried to tell it small, how the crate had come, how he'd moved it, but the Cums line. Now humming in the speakers Noah had brought, finished his sentences. It named driver plate numbers, a receipt stub tucked inside a jacket lining, the name of a mid-level broker who took cash in brown envelopes. Some listeners wept, some cursed. A man in the back rose and shouted that it was a lie, that he'd seen no such thing. Silence met him then. The Cums murmured a correction that was not its own, but a replay of an old wiretap the man had thought long buried. A call in which the man's voice said the broker's name and the date. The VFW fell into a hush that felt like a held breath. That night, a van outside the hall idled like a patient animal. Someone took pictures and passed them to Noah, who posted them the next morning. The van's license matched a company that had dissolved 10 years earlier. The internet decided the place was a smoking gun. The sheriff, pressured now by both community and law, authorized limited searches. He did not like the feeling of his own authority bending under the public tide, but the law had threads, and he followed them. Evie's research found a series of storage receipts hidden under County Ministini notations that tied Corvus Logistics to a riverside warehouse now owned by a church. The church let investigators in, more out of civic duty than faith. And on a rainy afternoon, officers found a sub-basement lined with crates and buried beneath a false floorboard, a ring of damaged ledgers. The ledgers were ledger enough: names, dates, routes, initials repeated like a pattern. Forensics matched fibers, handwriting, and the smell of coal dust that clung to the paper. As the evidence accumulated, men who had been comfortable recused themselves from Rotary meetings. Some left town without farewell. Others, like Tomlinson, fought. He hired counsel, cried ambushed on local radio, and called the Combs a hoax. The mind, smelling the flavor of resistance, changed tone. It began to replay phone calls, not abstractly, but in the exact cadence of speakers who had used coded language to cover their tracks. The effect was merciless. When someone lied, the shaft supplied the recording that contradicted them. One afternoon, a man with a thin face arrived in town and began pressuring witnesses and enforcer with legal cover. He met Frank on a back road and tried to intimidate him into silence. Frank refused and later stumbled home with a split lip. Noah and Evie took his injuries to the sheriff, but in the world where men had choices, threats carried weight. The enforcer thought he could choke the town into forgetfulness. He did not reckon on the Combs. At a clandestine hearing, the enforcer took the stand and, certain of his script, denied involvement. The shaft routed to the courtroom-s audio through Noah-s recorder, with the permission of a cautious judge, replayed a call the man had made to a buyer. The man's face drained. His voice was captured in its own confession. Officers moved in after the proceeding and brought him into custody on related charges. The arrests were not a cleansing. They were a beginning. The ledger pointed not only to stolen goods, but to the roots that had taken people out of town. A name in the margins Jasmine Bell made, a young woman named Maya, pull apart her father's attic until she found a faded scarf and a map with a penciled X. The shaft's voice had driven her hands with direction. The evidence gave her the first feeling of something other than doubt. Sheriff Harlan, whose choices from decades earlier had kept him in the comfortable shade of sleep, sat in a witness chair and read aloud the entrance forms he had signed, permits authorizing night transfers for equipment. He had not read the small print. Under oath, his rationalizations turned to equivocations that the Combs dissected mercilessly. Harlan's confession was not melodramatic. It was a slow unspooling of why he allowed certain shipments to pass. He spoke with the weight of a man who had made a pact with a different kind of survival. Town listened, some with relief, some with a new, deeper hurt. It is one thing to accuse a neighbor. It is another to learn your lawman had bent the law. In the weeks that followed, indictments came out in measured drops. Mid-level couriers pleaded guilty. A broker agreed to testify for reduced time. Tomlinson's trial began in a municipal court packed with residents who wanted to see what accountability looked like. The mind's Combs were played as evidence. Transcripts citing the voice's revelations were entered, strange and uncanny in the sterile hand of statute. Some jurors cried. Some jurors were stunned into silence. There were also failures. Not every trail led to a courtroom. Some buyers had moved their funds offshore. Some witnesses feared retaliation, and others simply could not remember enough to tie names to actions. The mind's voice had name and sound, but justice, in human courts, moved on slower rails. When the dust thinned enough for a vigil, Maya stood at the edge of the slag heap with a handful of the found item scarves. A bracelet, a child's shoe, and she placed them together near a low stone. She spoke Red Toma's name into the wind, and Evie, who had become the town's unlikely archivist of truth, read aloud portions of ledger lines that meant someone, somewhere, had to answer. The Combs came alive one last time as dusk leaned over the slag. For a long minute, it offered nothing but a slow carrier hum. Then, in the voice that had torn open the town's quiet, said, without judgment, and with a sadness that seemed to open the ground itself, "We tried to speak. You listened. Thank you." The sound thrummed in their bones like a note the earth keeps for itself. Some people wept. Others turned away, blinking as if they had been roused from a long sleep. Sheriff Harlan folded his hands in his lap and breathed as if he had been forgiven by the only authority that mattered to him. When the Cums finally quieted, no one cheered. There was only the brittle thought that some truths had been freed, but at a cost. Reputations broken, families riven, a town that would carry the stain of knowledge. Noah packed his recorder with hands that were both steadier and more careful than before. Evie cataloged every transmission, every ledger fragment, knowing that paper and audio would be uneven swords in the courtrooms ahead. That night, as the town returned to its small, wary routines, Noah drove home beneath a sky that looked dull and ordinary. He filed the last clip and labeled it Red Tomas Final. He left the recorder powered but asleep on his dashboard, an act of superstition more than science. Sometime after midnight, a carrier wave slipped through the long. Cold silence, a small, private sound, a breath against a microphone, and Noah, awake and alone, thought he heard a soft, almost contented murmur from the shaft, as if the earth were finally exhaling. He shut the rig down and watched the darkness hold. The mine had spoken its truth. Whether it slept or only waited was a question no one could honestly answer. The attic smelled of wet paper and old smoke. Evie Hart crouched between a stack of hymnals and a rusting umbrella. Fingertip tracing the faded ink on a list of donors from before the fires, rain pinned the town flat beneath the slate sky. The county museum's boiler clanked like a distant heart. She'd been cataloging salvaged boxes for weeks' photographs. School books, grocery listings people had shoved into crates and left with instructions not to open until the town could breathe again. The work felt holy and slow. She found the crate by accident, a plywood box tucked behind a trunk, stamped return to sender in block letters. The lid pulled up with a dry protest, and a cloud of soot drifted into her face. Inside were envelopes, blackened at the edges but intact, each addressed in the same precise, looping hand. Names she knew from the missing posters tacked to lampposts: Mrs. O'Leary. DeMarquez Boys, a name she hadn't expected to see in this light. Tommy Barlow. Evie's fingers left ash on the cream paper. Her rational mind supplied explanations: water damage, odd postal reroutes, but a softer voice in her chest nudged curiosity. She took the first envelope to the back room, where the lamps burned steady and the files were dry. The postmistress emerita, June Mallory, had once told her stories of letters that arrived years later with confessions tucked like secrets. Paper keeps its own counsel, June had said, smiling with teeth that knew every stamp, but it remembers where it belonged. Evie was not supposed to use open flames in the archive, but caution had a paper-thin edge compared to the ache of not knowing. She struck a match and cupped it, drawing the tiny flame toward the scorched dark lip of the envelope. The ash of the match smudged lightly as she rubbed a fingertip along the charred edge. At first, nothing. Then the paper shivered with ink. Letters formed as if the soot itself were a pen. Words bled up from the shadows into the neat hand she recognized from an old township ledger, photocopied Ami's hand. The script named names in a voice that was at once exact and ragged with old grief. "We buried more than letters. We took money," it read. Frankie Cole took the ledger. "Look in the root cellar under the Miller stone." Evie held the paper so close, the match smoke wrapped and tasted like burnt paper on the air. The confession felt impossibly intimate. Not a ghost's howl, but the careful, frightened handwriting of someone making sure the truth would out after his body could not. Her chest tightened. Tommy Barlow had been one of the loud men at the bar, exuberant and stained with coal, dusk on the week the seam fire started. To have his hand speaking now was a small, impossible mercy. She called Maya Bell before she thought to be frightened. Maya arrived with a thermos and a small, skeptical smile, and then went still when Evie unfolded the soot-ink confession. "Frankie Cole," Maya said, as if pronouncing the name might test it. Frankie was a familiar figure, a farmhand who degrown into a local fixer and then quietly prospered. He owned the barn everyone used for town dances, the place people mentioned when they spoke of economic recovery. "The Miller Stone?" Maya looked at Evie like a person checking a map. "There's a root cellar by the old mill. My grandmother used to say, there were holes you shouldn't poke. They went together before dawn, torches cutting through the mist. The mill crouched like an animal. The root cellar's stone lid lifted with work and language of shovel and gloved hands. It was as Tommy had written, a ledger wrapped in oilskin. Receipts marked Corvus Logistics. A stack of envelopes stamped with dates and names, the same uttered by the envelope in Evie's hands. The ledger's lines told a small economy of hush money, of shipments described as equipment that had been anything but. They did the sensible thing. They documented, they took photographs. They called the postmistress Emerita. June hummed, and then agreed, voice thin with something like recognition. "That's his scrawl," she said. "Tommy wrote on ledgers for the Union. He had that curl on the T, I'd know it in a storm." Evie posted a careful notice to the county board. "We found a document of importance. If you think you were named within, please come forward." The notice was a small legal thing meant to be measured. The town, which had been patient and numb, did not receive it as measured. People clustered at the mill, and word spread like a wind taking up speed. Some brought coffee. Some brought old grievances. A reporter from the regional press called Evie within an hour. Frankie Cole did not come to the mill himself. By mid-afternoon, the news had threaded through town in a flicker of misfortune accident. Later described as Frick began to hum down the line, one of Frankie's barns, an old structure he kept for storage, had collapsed. No one was dead. The animals were frightened, and the timbers fell in a way that left everyone shaking. It should have been an ordinary accident, and in a town used to strange weather and failing roofs, the event might have been unremarkable, except for how it felt. The ledger's tone had named specifics. The barn-esque collapse mirrored the ledger-esque accusation in a way that made the people who remembered the ledger say the word coincidence, like an apology. When Mayor Leonard Price called Evie into his office that evening, his tie was loosened, and his hands folded around a paper cup as if that were the only thing holding him together. "I am not asking you to stop the truth," he said, blunt and weary. "You're a historian. You do the right thing, but you have to understand the cost. People will be ruined. Lawsuits, pensions, even more dangerous people who'd rather not have this come out." Evie felt the ledger in her mind like a physical weight. "We found evidence," she said. "There are names, financial records. They point to places. We can't pretend this didn't happen." "You don't get to not know," he replied. And then softer. "And you don't get to unknow it without consequences." She left the office with the mayor's caution ringing in her ears and a new, colder fear coiling in her gut. Back at the museum, the rain had turned the windows into gray mirrors. The crate sat where she'd left it. She reached up for another envelope and then froze. A car idled outside on the street, a long, black shape with its headlights off, engine a patient, low hesitation. Nobody parked there. No errands ran that late. Someone was watching. Evie put the envelope back into the crate with hands that shook and locked the attic door behind her. The rain pattered like ash. She thought of Tommy's handwriting in Frankie's barn and the ledger wrapped in oilskin, and of the mayor's warning that the truth arrived with a price. I thought, too, of the name still inside the box. When she pressed the match to the edge of the next envelope, she felt less like a historian and more like a postman for someone who had been burned carrying other people's confessions home to a town that might not be ready to read them. The town's gossip moved faster than the rain. After the barn collapse, people no longer argued about whether the letters were supernatural. They argued about what to do with them. Some wanted the envelopes burned. Others felt the rage of long-denied justice. Evie and Maya tried to keep 2 evidence maps, photos, careful notes, but rumors walked the streets like dogs, and Mayor Price's warning now sounded like pleading. Evie found the courage to open another envelope the next morning. She took it to the back room, closed the door, and lit a match. The soot stilled like breath on glass. Then the handwriting surfaced. Not Tommy's this time, but a smaller, shakier hand. The script named a doctor who, decades earlier, had done favors in exchange for silence. It directed them to a parcel beneath the foundation of an old annex at the clinic. They did not go alone. Maya called June Mallory. Despite her age, the postmistress Emerita had a steadiness that countered hysteria. Together, they pried up the clinic's flagstone and found, wrapped in oilcloth like a dark egg, a small tin of identification bracelets, and a list of names with dates. The items were not enough to convict, but they were enough to reopen files and enough to pierce a family's doubt with proof. The letter's effects, however, were not tidy. Reversal, Evie learned, did not have to be a perfect symmetry. It could be an echo. Frankie's barn had not merely collapsed his insurance, lapsed mysteriously the week before. Neighbors swore they heard a hiss the night the beams went. The clinic's annex had a slow subsidence of its own, a foundation crack that made the town murmur that the building had returned what it had eaten. People with reputations began to lose them in small, unpleasant ways. A shop burned out, a contractor's load fell into a ravine. A retired official suffered a stroke at his kitchen table. No one said that the letters killed. They said instead that the town's buried weight had a way of shifting the earth under people's feet. At a council meeting, tempers frayed into accusation. Mayor Price sat with his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. "You cannot publish every envelope you find," he said. "There are families, bank accounts, elderly men with mortgages. We will have lawsuits. We will have blood." Maya, who had a photograph of her missing grandmother in her wallet and a tin of hairpins she had discovered under the clinic's floor, answered in a voice that did not waver. "We have to know. That necklace belonged to my grandmother. Don't get to choose which truths are messy." The mayor's solution and advisory panel, legal counsel. Moratorium felt like a truce only for those who wanted time to hide. People who had goods buried beneath their porches did not want time. They wanted smoke. For a week the town simmered. Someone scrawled Leah on Evie's car with a key. Rock broke her bathroom window. She thought about burning the crate, about dropping the envelopes into the river, about waiting until someone with authority, someone less loved and less likely to be personally implicated, could handle them. But the letters were not papered to be ignored. They smelled faintly and insistently of people who had been wronged. The envelopes kept coming. They were not really coming, but sometimes in the way of small towns where memory is a concrete thing. A new box would appear in the attic at dawn, as if the house had decided to cough up a secret. Each one needed a match and a hand to rub the soot. Each one made a new map. Then Evie opened the last, the one that tightened her stomach into a small, obedient fist. The soot breathed itself into a hand she knew intimately. Professor Alan Reed's script. He had been her mentor, an old archivist who taught her to read with tenderness. He lived 2 blocks from the museum, in a house that smelled of dust and peppermint lozenges. The handwriting was not gentle. The letter, in terse sentences, admitted to moving a child's trunk out of sight, under the millstone, and arranging payment for silence when the fire came. Named dates, and a name Evie had not expected to read. She carried the letter like a confession and refused, for a day, to show anyone. She thought of Alan's hands, the way he tapped his pen when something moved him. The way he once stopped her from making a public claim about an archive until she had cross-checked a source 3 times. This was the man who had taught her, who had given her the first photocopied ledger months ago and smiled, proud, when she had found a name. To expose him felt like taking apart a bone. She confronted him that evening. Alan sat in his small kitchen, with 2 teacups cooling on the table, and for a long time he denied. Then he did what some humans do when the earth presses. He told a different truth, one of fear and small choices. "We were told to move things," he said, eyes fixed on the window. "They promised no one would be harmed. We were young, we were terrified. After the seam fires, survival is its own kind of crime." Evie could hear the ledger of his life unspool. He begged her to keep the letter private. "There are grandchildren," he said. "There is age. We are not monsters." The rule that governed these letters did not ask whether a confessor was monster or man. It simply made the truth find daylight. Evie had a decision she would not take lightly. To publish the letter against him would mean the town might reach for the leveling force the letters brought. A reversal might hurt Alan. His house might sink. His name might be torn, or it might break someone else. To keep the letters secret would be to choose peace over justice and to let the dead keep speaking in shadows. She slept poorly and rose before the sun. She made 2 calls, one to Maya, who answered with silence and then with a plan. The other to Sheriff Price, whose voice was flat now, with a different sort of resignation. Together, in a small band of people who had lost things, they agreed to act not by spectacle, but by mitigation. They notified the county dig team. They called in a forensics group from the university. And they set safety measures in place. Trenches would be shored. Neighbors warned. The town cleared away from possible collapse zones. They made their publication public in a single, careful step. An advertised meeting where Evie would read the letter aloud and the county would begin controlled excavations at the sites named by the letters. It was an attempt to put structure around the chaos, to let truth be found in daylight rather than by accident. When Evie read Alan's name into the high school gym that evening, the room took on the charged hush of a courtroom. Mayor Price sat stiff, eyes wet at the edges. Alan, pale as a bone, did not cry. He simply watched the floor as if the ledger of his life were a map on which he had just lost his bearings. The first reversal was not a spectacular collapse. It was slower and meaner. The ground under Alan's back lawns softened over the next week, a sinkhole opening where the millstone lay hidden. Work crews found, wrapped in tar, a child's trunk and a folded shawl. The discovery tore wounds open, some raw and right, others twisting and new. Alan's house did not fall in. The ground gave him back what they had tried to hide, and with it, the force of shame he had long stored. Some in town cheered the unearthing. Others said the cost was too high. Evie felt both the relief of truth and the sourness of consequence. She had done what the dead asked, she read. She had also, by doing so, set in motion a machine that did not temper its blows. In the weeks that followed, small reparations occurred. Apologies returned property, a few shallow graves properly marked. The town did not become whole, became quieter in a different way, less certain, more watchful. On a rain-heavy morning when Evie returned to the museum after a night of notes and calls, the attic door was ajar. Inside, a new crate lay on the floor, its wood unweathered. She had not ordered it. Her fingers trembled as she pried it open. At the bottom, nestled in ash like a small heart, was a single envelope, black at the lip and waiting. Evie did not light a match immediately. She sat with the crate and held the envelope in both hands, feeling the ache of what the town had gained and the cost it had paid. The postman, the town's deadwood, she understood, keep delivering until every secret had been read. She could not know whether that was mercy or hunger. She struck a match and cupped the flame. The smoke rose, and she brushed the soot to the edge of the paper. The letters would appear. The town would know. Miles had learned to read the city by its empty hours. He knew which streets held the drunk and the desperate, which storefronts still lit a dull neon at 3 a.m, and which edges of town went soft into fog. Driving those hours paid his rent and kept his head clear. He told himself he liked the anonymity, the anonymous requests, the weight of other people's lives falling into the passenger seat and leaving no mark. So when his navigation app pinged with a route, he never seen an old county bus icon and a label that read Route 666 in a faded banner, he laughed and assumed a glitch. He'd seen map errors before, phantom alleys, misrouted highways. But the icon pulsed as if waiting, and for a moment the maps blew, slid toward it like a moth. Curiosity is cheap on midnight drives. He tapped the route and watched the map redraw. It threaded him across backstreets he hadn't taken in years, a dotted line that winked with stop points like the breathing of a thing asleep, then waking. The first stop was a turnout behind a shuttered laundromat. The second, a long-forgotten bus shelter with graffiti peeling from its ribs. Could have ignored it. He didn't. He parked under the shelter's leaking roof and stepped into cold rain. At his feet, half buried in grit and leaves, he found a tiny shoe, the kind that had been taken off a child in an instant and never seen again. It was scuffed, its laces knotted in a childish, useless bow. Beside it, a scrap of a flyer, yellowed and damp, named a missing girl from a case that had gone cold 15 years earlier. He took a photo and posted it to a local community forum with the kind of flippant caption rideshare drivers use to make a night less lonely. Look what Route 666 found. The replies came in a handful of astonished messages, then one that made the hair stand. Up on his arms, the detective who had handled the missing girl. Case Nora Ruiz, asking whether the shoe had been left where the post said. Nora's voice on the phone was professional and flat, the way someone has to be when old grief is stirred. Keep the shoe where it is, she told him. Don't touch anything else. I'm coming out. Within an hour, Miles met her at the bus shelter. Nora was not the kind of person who believed in ghosts. She believed in evidence and procedure. When she crouched beside the shoe and traced the flyer, her mouth pressed thin. We were told there were no leads, she said. If this connects, we'll need forensics. We'll need an affidavit. While Nora photographed the shoe, Miles showed her the map on his phone. The ghost bus icon blinked as if in response. I saw this route pop up about 3 nights ago, he said. At first, it looked like a joke. Tonight I followed it. The stops lead to places I'd never thought to check. Nora watched the map and frowned. That bus stopped running the year these disappearances started, she said. The county cut the line when budgets tightened. Nobody's been able to account for why those people vanished. Her fingers hovered over the screen like someone reading a pulse. All right, by the time they left, Evie Park had called. She worked in the transit office and kept odd server logs for hobbyists like herself, patterns and bus telemetry, leftover manifests. She'd noticed a cluster of anomalous pings on the county feeds that only appeared at night for devices with certain registration histories. It's not on the county servers, she said over the phone, but some phones can see it. It recalculates when you approach a stop, and then nudges you to go to the next one. It's like someone laid a ghost route into the app, and the dots keep updating themselves. Miles drove while Nora and Evie talked about data and warrants. He followed the map as it curled through the sleeping streets. Each stop yielded small things: a locket taped beneath a bench, a ledger page pinned with a rusted nail under a bridge, a child's marble tucked inside a drainage pipe. None of it answered the question of why the bus route existed on his screen, but all of it breathed new life into files that had gathered mildew in the cold case drawers. At the third stop, the map did something that turned the hair on his neck into pins. When Evie zoomed in remotely, a tiny overlay appeared beside the marker. A name. Not an address or a clue, just a single living name, bold and clinical, as if the route had a voice and preferred to speak directly. It read, Randy Kell. Miles had heard the name before. Randy Kell owned property on 3 blocks, sponsored the county fair, and made a habit of reminding people which side his bread was buttered on. He was the sort of man who could make a rumor stop by paying for the right silence. The overlay blinked once, and the map recalculated, the route bending like a reluctant hand toward a storage yard on the River Road. Randy Kell storage yard. They didn't rush there immediately. Nora insisted on paperwork. Evie pulled device logs and breadcrumb caches as proof the route had visited each coordinate. Miles went to the forum again and posted the small artifacts with caution, careful to call out the cold case thread rather than sensationalize. Still, his feed filled with private messages, some supportive, some angry, some thinly veiled threats. That night, he found a car idling outside his building when he pulled up, a long shadow under streetlight. He sat in his van and watched through the rain-smeared windshield. The vehicle's radio was low, but someone moved inside, paper rustling, a figure passing a hand along the seat. After a while it left, tires whispering away, but the sense of being watched followed Miles up to his apartment. He told Nora and Evie about it in a voice that tried to be casual and failed. Nora's jaw tightened. Evie, who had never met Randy Kell, but had seen how power made bureaucrats lie, said the map's overlay might be naming someone the spirits wanted someone to look at. If the route is showing the victim's stops, Evie said, and if it's assigning a name as the next fare, then maybe the bus, if that. What it is, has its own idea of who should be held to account. Miles thought of the shoe in the shelter, the ledger page under the bridge, the way the bus had drawn him through streets he had never wanted to see again. He thought, too, of the idling car, of the way a map could become a summons. He closed his eyes for a beat and opened them to the glow of the ghost bus icon, pulsing like a distant heart. When he dropped his phone onto the passenger seat, the route recalculated again, softer this time, as if impatient. The next stop blinked onto the map. Then another name nudged into place, like the whisper of a conductor calling the next passenger, a reminder that a bus, even one that had been retired to rust and budget cuts, could still be a vehicle for the dead if the living would only follow. The morning after the shelter shoe, the town felt like a place that had been licked by a new light, people moving with small, careful purpose, like those waking to a weather warning. Miles slept badly. Staff kept his phone on the dash, the ghost bus icon glowing faint through the dark like a promise or a threat. Nora moved faster than Miles expected. She filed for a series of limited warrants, citing newly discovered physical evidence linked to cold cases. Evie pulled archived manifests and cross-referenced property records. She found a line item that put Corvus shipments at Randy Kell's storage yard the year the disappearances accelerated. When Nora read the affidavit in a courthouse window, the judge signed without the theatricality the town liked to imagine, just a stamp and a tired nod. The law, when pushed right, still had teeth. They went out that night in Nora's unmarked car with flashlights and shovels and a camera. Miles drove slow enough for the map to breathe. At each stop, the app exhaled a new overlay, a name, a hint. At the bridge, they unearthed a shoebox of documents wrapped in wax paper, letters with initials, payroll stub with a corrupt broker's signature. At the rail siding, a child's marble rolled out from a crack in the timbers. Each discovery tightened the skeleton of a story into something you could see. Randy's property sat back from the river, a low chain-link fence, and a row of corrugated units that smelled of oil. The app's final stop blinked like a red eye. When Nora presented the warrant, a security guard tried to block them with a legal-sounding stammer. Private property. No, Nora was older than the stammer and calmer. We have a warrant to search, she said.
What?
Inside the first unit, they found what they had hoped, a small trunk of personal effects. Jewelry and ID bracelets that linked to missing person reports. It was the kind of soft evidence that, when threaded with a ledger, becomes a chain. In the back of the second unit, an officer's boot kicked a weathered crate. Inside, more items and a stack of folded receipts stamped with a discreet emblem Miles recognized from the Corvus notes. A ledger hid under greasy tarpaulin, dates, addresses, at one line that read, Route Pickup, 2,330 paid. The ledger had names and initials that placed payments and pickups on nights long described as foggy and odd. They were mid-search when men in dark jackets moved along the perimeter. Someone on a pickup idled outside, and the engine did not die. Nora's radio hissed with an officer asking for plates. A shadow peeled from the pickup and crossed the lot, purposeful and unhurried, like someone practicing the steps of intimidation. Miles felt something old, how fear flexes like muscle. The men tried to shut the operation down by pounding on an officer's window and by making a phone call that was meant to be heard by everyone. You don't want this, it said, thinly polite. Walk away, kid. Leave the town to sleep. They did not walk away. A chase snarled out when one of the men ran for the gate and leaped into the pickup. Officers boxed the vehicle, and a short, rubber-legged pursuit ended with the pickup fish tailing into a ditch.
Ow.
One man bailed and ran, leaving his phone in the cab. Miles stood close to the mud and the phone and felt a strange lift in his chest. Sometimes the truest evidence is what someone forgets or drops when panic makes them human. The phone had recordings, voice notes, and a call log to a number listed in Randy Kell's business directory. The recordings were thin with the gravel of adult caution, arrangements, drop points, the phrase, keep the route clean. The voice on one note did not belong to an anonymous courier. It used Randy's tone, the clipped style of someone used to buying discretion. Nora's face went hard when she played it aloud. Randy did not go quietly in the papers. Within 24 hours, he was on local radio denying everything with a practiced charm that had once opened civic coffers. He hired lawyers and bristled at hearings. But charm does not make tar go away from a ledger, and the ledger made a pattern that matched other found items. A warrant to search Randy's office turned up email threads with a coded language that, when placed beside the ledger, read like a map of shame. He was arrested for obstruction and for evidence tampering. The district attorney pressed on, driven by the ledger and the recordings. Randy's legal team skittered like fish, and for a city used to tidy verdicts, the mess of it all was new. Some in town took comfort in the public charge. Others whispered that powerful men could still buy loopholes. The difference, Nora said to Miles, is that when enough small things pile up, shoe, marble, ledgers, the heap will tip. When the case moved into its early public days, the Ghost Bus app behaved as if it had been following along the whole time. One by one, the blue stops on Miles's map grayed out. Soft notification showed. Route completed. The overlay that had been naming people flickered one last time, and then settled into a single line of text. Thank you. People came to the evidence rooms and held old toys and bracelets and pieces of identity, as if the items themselves radiated relief. Some victims' relatives cried. Some sat stoic with the opacity of a lifelong armored by not knowing. Miles watched Nora sit with a woman who had kept a missing child's photo under glass for years. The woman touched the recovered bracelet and let out a breath long and breaking, and then steady. Not everything ended with Randy's arrest. Some of the people the route had called for remained untouched, wealthy buyers with offshore accounts. Names that slipped through subpoenas like slick fish. Some men fled town. The route had not been a perfect engine of justice. It had been a stubborn one. The night after the raids, Miles opened his app out of habit. Where the Ghost Bus had been, a single tiny blue dot moved across the map, slow, and solitary, until it reached the old transit depot and paused. Then it moved again, a neat line toward the river where the lights of the town blurred into dark water. The dots slipped over the river's skin, and as Miles watched with the kind of small prayer you say when you not sure people answer, it vanished. Evie sent a short message into their group chat. Route logged. Archive saved. Nora replied, "We close files. But we don't forget." Miles sat with his hands on the wheel, and a world that felt less like a puzzle than a ledger with pages finally turned. The bus was gone from the maps, its stops dimmed. The app kept a log like smoke in a jar of chords that would, in time, be used in court. He thought of the victims riding that impossible night, bus voices like passengers who had all the same destination. He thought of the map that had become a seance and the way technology could be a bridge between memory and law. The town breathed uneven and new, and Miles drove the blue dot of his own life home, knowing that if other phantom routes ever blinked on his screen, he would follow them because some commitments, once made, are not meant to be walked away from.